Hello and welcome to Faith Talks. In today's program, we'll be asking, does Christianity make people bigoted? Joining me in the studio today are Pastor Shaq Venter and youth pastor Steve Holbert. Welcome to both of you. So let's perhaps start with defining, what does it mean, the word bigoted? Shaq.
I think intolerance comes to mind, and I think it is often prescribed to somebody who is not open to other opinions or views, somebody that holds something with a sense of prejudice almost when other people don't believe or see things in the same way. But it's not just a belief, it's actually when it's acted out. I think people experience bigotry. They don't just see it necessarily, I think they experience it.
Yeah, I think it's basically a fear of being taken out of a comfort zone, meeting something new and how you react to it. And I think bigotry is the name of the negative reaction to something that's new.
So we're talking today about Christians being bigoted, but you're both working in the ministry as pastors on different church styles. But have you come across somebody judging you, evaluating you for being a Christian yourself?
Yeah, I remember as a young pastor, I hope I'm still young, but I remember as a young pastor just coming into the idea of ministering to community people, not just Christians, but to all people. I remember having decided to buy a laptop at first, and I must just say I grew up in South Africa, so this experience was in South Africa, not here in Britain. And I remember going to buy this laptop. It was at a second-hand shop, and it was a very expensive laptop, and it was a second-hand laptop, as I said. And I remember wanting to buy this, and the people that were helping me behind the counter, we were just talking, and I was full of energy, and I was excited about my faith and being a young pastor. And I told them, I'm a pastor and so on, and bought this laptop. Something wasn't right about it, so I took it back. And after discussing it a little bit, I said to them, no, I want my money back. And I had paid for this cash with quite a large sum of money. And they just didn't want to give me my money back. And I stood my ground, and I decided, no, I want my money back. And they said, one of the young men, I just remember him saying, well, this is just it. Sometimes if you as Christians or as pastors don't get your way, then this is how you act. I can't believe it. You're all the same. And I think at that point, I experienced somebody assuming that we are, as Christians, we are bigots. That was my first encounter as a Christian.
That sounds very interesting that they reacted that strongly to you being a Christian pastor. Steve, is it something you've come across?
Most of the time, I guess because of the way I look, most people don't really know that I'm a pastor. So, it always comes across as a surprise. And usually people that I meet, I've met enough times already that when the whole kind of this is what I do as a job comes out, this is who I am, because they already know me pretty well. It doesn't really deter them, and so there's guys that I play basketball with, and initially for the first few months or so I'm just playing basketball with them, but then the more you get to see people, the more you talk about other things other than basketball, and so when it comes out, one of them's working at a pub up the road, one of them works for a cafe and those kind of things, those kind of jobs, and then they ask me what I do, and so I just tell them that I'm a pastor. And there's initial shock because it's like, I guess in their mind, pastors don't generally go out and play basketball in their local park, and so there's an idea in people's head of what pastors do, and certainly basketball's not one of them, and surfing isn't, and so when it comes to that, there's an initial shock, but because they've seen me outside of the concept of what they view a pastor being. I guess I've not really experienced the situation firsthand where the first thing I'm telling someone that I've never met before is I'm a pastor. And so I've never had to experience that kind of reaction and what the results of that are. Because most of the time, I guess I'm just getting to know people before, the same way that they then get to know me.
So, Steve, it's interesting. You don't go up and shake people's hands before you say basketball. Hi, I'm Pastor Steve. I'm assuming that's not how you're functioning. And I don't think any of us are actually functioning that, of those of us who are in the studio. But, Shaq, why do you think that people are so shocked or draw back or have such strong reaction when you say you're a pastor?
I think they're not necessarily drawn back because I'm a pastor. I think at times it's the immediate assumption that I have certain Christian values, or that I think at times they attribute certain Christian perspectives to me in that moment. And I think that's because it's preconceived ideas as to what Christians are in general. And I think the times when people react like that, I had a friend who's also a pastor, but he had an interesting experience, almost similar to Steve's, but different. He got to know a person quite well through some program or something that they were doing, and this person became, they got to know him, but they didn't know he was a Christian. Neither did they know he was a pastor. And then after a few months, when they actually found out, it came to light that he was a pastor and that he was a Christian pastor. She said, "Oh, what a shame! If you were anything but a Christian, I probably would have enjoyed our friendship even more." And that surprised him. Who he was as a friend nullified her preconceived ideas of what Christians are. But when it came to light, she still had this very strong feelings as to who Christians are, what they represent, and the ideas that they have. And I think often negative attributes, people hold firm to those negative experiences, and then often when you then encounter somebody else who's in a similar context or a similar frame of mind, you attribute that negative experience to them, and you kind of generalize it. I think it's that kind of experience.
But why do you think it has come to that? Because you go to other parts of the world, and they're like, "Oh, you're a pastor," and it's a compliment. It's something to be aspired to. Why do you think here in Britain that there seems to be this withdrawal when people find out you're a Christian?
I think Britain tends to have a lot of lack of trust in anything that looks like authority. And I know that's not unique to Britain. There's other countries that have the same kind of approach to it. But I think it's a particularly strong way of thinking in Britain. And so, we can't trust our government, we can't trust our church, we can't trust our boss at work. And there seems to be that kind of thing going on. When I look at church, I don't like to look at the role of a pastor as an authoritative figure over anyone. I think pastors are pretty much along the same sort of journey that anyone else is when it comes to spirituality. Obviously, there's a certain amount of learning that they've put into how they became a pastor, and so there'll be a way to approach things that they might have had more learning in than your standard Christian. But at the same time, I don't think that was ever really the biblical requirement of a pastor to be, a replacement for who Jesus is. Jesus is the ultimate authority. And so as a church, I think sometimes we've made the mistake of putting pastors into the place of Jesus, which is why, in some denominations, in some countries, the way a pastor is looked at, there's a kind of an admiration of like, wow, almost a bowing down sort of approach to pastors. But then here in the UK, obviously, we don't have that, and there's a lot of mistrust, particularly in how Christianity has been portrayed in media as well. And stories that have come out of anything from the Vatican to even in Protestantism, there's stories that come out that the media jumps upon, which fuels the mistrust of Christianity and the church, and so there's and Britain tends to kind of live off those kind of stories and those kind of things, and that's why we love scandals in government and scandals in the church and scandals in big companies, and so and so there's this like mistrust that seems to take place.
I have a different take on it. I think Christianity has a long history with not just Britain but Europe, going back all the way to the Middle Ages. And I think looking back at the history when things were done in the name of God, and those things were not necessarily that you would find any strong biblical principle support for. Those things have created a sense of mindset, and having world wars, just having recently, reflected on 70 years of D-Day, I think, having world war and then having religion and all those things mixed with it, I think a lot of people have lost their trust in the faith of Christianity and the faith that Christianity holds to, because things were done in the name of Christ, in the name of God. That's not necessarily biblical, good biblical principles. And so you're having centuries of this that builds up with secularism that's there, with the postmodern viewpoint of what I believe and what I hold onto is right for me. All of this mix into one big community, postmodern cosmopolitan community that Britain has become. You can understand why you have so many different views, extreme views, liberal views. You have it in there, but there's a big history with it.
But I think what you're saying, Steve, also is that the media jumps into any sensationalism, and there's nothing more sensationalist that when any faith groups comes across as being bigoted. And of course, those are more interesting media stories, aren't they? That's what we see in our newspaper. You add that to a mistrust that is already saturated in yourself. It is no wonder that so many feel that Christians are bigoted, because they only see extreme views in the media. And as you were saying, Jacques, you were alluding to that Britain, is not as Christian as we were before, because people have lost the trust in that. Therefore, today, you may go through your whole schooling life without meeting another Christian. So it fosters those bigoted views. But have we created that for ourselves? Have we Christians actually added to people's perception of us being a bigoted religion?
I think Christianity runs the danger of inflaming it because of what it stands for, because of what it promotes. When you promote kindness, goodness, gentleness, and all those things, when that is what Christianity stands for, when Christianity is about the concern for others rather than myself, but yet instead of practicing that, yes, you run the risk of being labeled, but you're not practicing what you're preaching. And that's in any society, any community, any group of people that hold to a certain value system, but they don't practice that value system, will be eventually blamed for not practicing it, for not holding to it. And Christianity, for a very long time, has done this. And just who we are and what we believe and what we promote lends itself to being finger-pointed.
But where's the balance between standing up for your faith and what you believe in and being perceived as a bigot?
I suppose it would depend on what you're standing up for, in a way. Because I found that most of the sort of negative concepts of Christianity that I found in people always stem from either something that's happened to them in the past, in regards to a Christian that they met, or someone that their parents met, and so cause, I've been down to the local primary school just down the road from where I live in St Austell, and spoken there a couple of times in the classes, and there's kids there that come from Christian backgrounds and things like that, but there's also kids that don't, and it's interesting to hear some of the questions that they have and you know that really it's not what they were thinking, it's what their parents were thinking and what their parents have passed down to them. And so when, you know, these little kind of like 8-9-year-olds are asking you questions, it's really their parents asking you a question, but they just look a lot littler. And you just see these kind of negative concepts of Christianity basically being asked there. And I think to some degree, some have a genuine first-hand bad experience with Christians, but some have just inherited the experience from others, and then there's this like view that's created about it. And so yeah, how do we as Christians, how do we then approach that? Because I think it's easier to talk to someone that's had the experience of, you know, meeting maybe a Christian that didn't live up to what they were preaching. But then there's those who haven't had the experience but still have the same view as the one that did have the experience. And how do we then deal with that?
But I think also it's something we talked about earlier, was that the media is not interested in your average Joe. The media is not interested in portraying a story from the average Christian that is not out there outrageous in one way or the other extreme. And so could it also be that a lot of people today hold views that Christians are bigoted because they don't know any average Christian people? They've just read about extremism in papers.
Yeah, I think somebody once said that what makes news is super good and super bad. And I find that very interesting, because super good sometimes makes us feel guilty that we're not like that. But super bad is what keeps us interested in the stories. And I agree with you. I think the average Joe and Jane doesn't make for a good story to tell. But I think it does make for us not feeling so lonely, you know, in that sense that there are others that are like us, that are average. But in their averageness, they have a sense of balance, a sense of love for life, a sense of peace. Why is it? And I think that's where, in terms of standing up for our faith, I think it's not about standing up for what is right and wrong. That is important, and I think that should be done. But I think it's more often standing up for that faith, but with that attitude of kindness, caring. And it's nice if the media picks up on those stories, but they don't. They most often pick up on the other ones, because it creates a sense of good read.
But would you agree to today that there are incidents in our larger Christian families that actually justify that some people feel that Christians are bigoted?
Yeah, I would agree to that. And I wouldn't be surprised if I at times have been like that, where I hold something so strong that I'm not willing to be open to conversation. And I think not being willing to be open to conversation, not being willing to grow myself and try and understand somebody else in the shoes in which they stand, I wouldn't be surprised if I've at times come across like that. And then I add to the idea that Christians are bigoted, and to that something I would be ashamed of doing. But I think it's so easy to do. It's so easy to hold to something so strong that you're not willing to open yourself up to a conversation. And I think that's one of the dangers that we as Christians face. Once we've reached the point where we believe something, we think that's it. And we're not willing necessarily to have further open conversations about something.
And how do we move from that? How do we move from holding our faith and what we believe and standing up for that to having spaces of conversation, spaces where we can come together and differ?
I think sometimes because of this history that has been talked about, you know, there's a reaction to Christianity, and obviously Christianity has a reaction to that. And I think sometimes we always feel like we need to defend our faith. But I actually firmly believe that we don't need to defend it. I think faith will defend itself. And that if we just follow what it is that God asks of us in the scriptures, to love people, to seek after things like, joy and peace and self-control and love and those kind of things, to love God and to love our neighbour. Those things will defend Christianity. And I think we just get into a big mess when we try and do it on our own and just come forward with to rebuttal what's being said about us. And I think the best way to approach that is to genuinely be what we read in the scriptures, to be love.
It reminds me of an experience I had. A year or so ago, I had a habit of stopping over at Starbucks every morning or every other day on my way to the office. And I remember at times having a drink there, just drinking something, especially it was in the winter months. And one specific morning every week, there was this group of ladies, and they were always there. They would come together. Some of them would have prams with little toddlers and little babies, but they were there, and they would just chat, and they would just be a little community, this community of people. And I must admit, at times I was listening to some of the conversations, and it was just conversations about nothing, about the everyday thing, the everyday mundane thing. And I wonder if we as Christians at times, because we live in our bubbles, we live in a world where we live in our bubbles, in our own world. We've got to get on with our lives. We've got to get on with our work. We've got to do this. We're so isolated and individualized that we forget to just be with others. You see our young people walk around with things in their ears and on the phone. They don't lift up their eyes. They don't acknowledge him. They're in their own world. And you have this group of ladies. And I read an article recently about such a group, and a lady who had such an experience. And she says that was her world. She would do anything just to get to that group. Why? Not because they were talking about how the world is being shaped and so on, but they were talking about their everyday stuff and realizing that other people struggle with the same things. And I think we need to have more spaces where and more small communities almost like that, where we allow people, and we are part of that. We should be part of that. Where we just share in each other's needs. We share in each other's issues. I need to know that John or Jane has the same issues that I have, and realize, wait a minute, we're a group of people. And above all, I think that should happen in a sense where that person's issues are more important than mine. I believe we're in a world, and I think this is where Christians have an opportunity to change this perspective of bigotry, is where we truly not just defend our faith, but we live it, where we truly live, where that person's issues, their concerns, the struggles that they have are more important than mine.
But isn't it hard also? Because Christians, as you're saying, we are living in a bubble. We come across so easily as a little bit better than everybody else, that we've got it more together because as Christians, that's what we're told we should. And does that not add to this whole misconception of Christians are someone else? They're a little bit looking down on everyone else, and they're feeling a little bit better than thou.
Yeah, which is a really big mistake of us. Because realistically, we are no better than anyone else. It's only Jesus that masks who we are, that makes us maybe look better on the outside. But he tells us in the scriptures that we're just mucky people. But he covers us in this white covering that and so that when we come before God, we look acceptable.
It reminds me of the story of the neighbor or the young man who comes to Jesus, and he says to him, "What do I have to do to inherit eternal life?" And Christ says to him, "You got to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind, and you have to love your neighbor as yourself." And then he asks this question, "Who's my neighbor?" And Christ points out, it's actually that person that you really hate. And so he goes to the extreme. He says, you want to know neighbor? Neighbor incorporates everybody. And that story reminds me of the idea that how does Jesus measure Christian living? How does he measure this thing that we call Christianity? And Christ, I've always wondered, what would we have said if he only spent his time with the Pharisees and with the Sadducees and the church and the priests? What would we have said? Would we have said, well, look, he cares for the others who are not like him. He cares for those who are in need. What about those who have leprosy? What about the prostitutes? What about the Samaritan? What would we have said about Christ? And so for Christ, the measurement of true Christian living is when you find yourself outside of your own context, your own comfortable context, and you can measure your actions. What does your actions say about you when you are in a context that challenges your personality, your personal life? And I think as Christians, we need to move beyond our realm of Christian friends. And we need to find ourselves in contexts where we are not comfortable, where other people's concerns and their needs demand our attention and our actions. That way I think we can measure on whether or not we are really Christians.
And that comes back to then that by doing that, as both of you are suggesting, by living out your faith in being the salt of the earth, which is another thing that comes up, and just being real and being where people are, perhaps that will diminish people's perception of Christians being bigoted. So living out what Jesus is asking us to do, but also holding up the mirror to ourselves and saying, am I being a bigot myself? Mm-hmm. Am I really contributing to people's perception of me being judgmental? And how do I balance that with standing up for my faith? Well, thank you so much for both of you for such an interesting discussion today. And why not add your voice to the debate by joining us on our Facebook page @Faith Talks. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next time.